Damon's fist landed against my collarbone hard enough to push me back into my own front door. Not a punch. A shove disguised as a warning, the kind men like him use when they want witnesses to see, just a disagreement instead of assault. Next time you talk back to me, he said, close enough that I could smell the bourbon on his breath at 11 in the morning, I'm putting you in an ambulance. And she's going to watch every second of it. He tilted his head toward Maya. My daughter stood on the porch step behind me, 10 years old, her school backpack clutched against her chest like a shield. She wasn't crying. That was the part that broke something loose in my chest. She'd already learned not to cry in front of him, the same way I'd learned not to blink in front of men holding rifles. I want to be honest about what I was thinking in that moment, because the version of this story where I stayed calm out of wisdom would be a lie. I was thinking about the exact sequence of movements it would take to put Damon Vance on the ground before he finished his sentence. Wrist, elbow, throat. 3 seconds, maybe less. I didn't move. I said, "Get off my porch." That's all. 4 words. And I watched something flicker across his face, not fear, not yet, just confusion, the way a man looks when the thing he's been told is weak refuses to act weak. My name is Elena Vance. I'm 34 years old, and for 6 years I told almost nobody what I actually did before I became a logistics coordinator for Ridgeline County's Public Works Department. I let my neighbors believe I spent my 20s doing supply chain work for a defense contractor in Germany. That was true, technically, in the way a lot of half-truths are technically true. What I didn't tell them was that I spent 4 of those years as a combat instructor attached to a special operations group, training operators twice my size in close-quarters disarmament, and that I walked away from a pension and a promotion in March of 2019 because my husband died in a car accident on Route 9 outside Fort Campbell, and I had a 9-month-old daughter who needed a mother who came home every night. I traded a career built on controlled violence for a 2-bedroom rental on Larchmere Drive in a subdivision called Oak Ridge Estates, where the biggest scandal before that spring had been whether the Hendricksons were allowed to paint their mailbox teal. I am not a perfect person. I'll say that now so you understand what's coming. I am short-tempered when I'm exhausted. I have trouble asking for help, actual help, not the polite kind you turn down twice before accepting. And I have a specific, ugly fear that sits underneath everything else I feel, that one day Maya is going to look at me the way people looked at her father when they found out what he really did for a living. Like I'm dangerous. Like I'm someone to be careful around. That fear is exactly why I didn't fight back on my own porch on the morning of April 14th. Victoria and Damon Vance moved into 4417 Larchmere Drive, directly across the street from us, on February 2nd. I remember the date because it was the same week Maya's school sent home the permission slip for her spring science fair project, and I remember standing at my kitchen window watching a moving truck unload a leather sectional sofa that probably cost more than my car, thinking, that's odd, for a street where the average home sells for $340,000. Victoria is my older sister. We hadn't spoken in 4 years before that moving truck showed up, not since our mother's funeral, where Victoria stood up during the reception and told our aunts, in front of 40 people, that I'd abandoned the family by moving away for the military instead of staying home to help with our father's medical bills. She never mentioned that our father's will, read 3 weeks after the funeral by a notary named Gregory Aldous at his office on Fenwick Street, left her the house, the savings account, and 60% of the estate, while I received a coin collection and a letter I still haven't fully forgiven him for writing. Victoria had spent 11 years being the daughter who stayed close, who called every Sunday, who made sure everyone remembered it. I had spent those same 11 years being the daughter who left, and in my family, leaving was never forgiven, no matter the reason. Damon, I learned quickly, ran something called Iron Line Fight Club out of a converted warehouse off Route 22, unsanctioned, cash only, the kind of underground circuit where men bet on each other's ability to withstand damage. He was 6 feet 3 inches, somewhere around 230 pounds of genuine, trained muscle, not gym mirror muscle. He'd fought professionally for 2 years before a suspension for a fixed-match scandal in Reno ended that career, and pushed him underground, where the money was better and the rules were optional. He liked being looked at. He liked being feared. And within 3 weeks of moving onto our street, he'd already blocked the Pattersons' driveway twice with his truck, put a dent in Mr. Okafor's garage door during an argument about trash cans, and started playing music loud enough at 1 a.m. that Maya came into my room twice asking if she could sleep with the fan on to drown it out. I asked him to turn it down on March 30th, standing in his driveway at 9:40 p.m. in my work clothes, because I had a 6 a.m. shift the next morning, and my daughter had a math test. Victoria answered instead of him, arms crossed, wine glass in hand. Some of us actually have a life, Elena. Not everyone wants to live like a monk in a rental. I want you to notice that word, rental. Victoria knew, because I'd made the mistake of mentioning it once at a family gathering years earlier, that I was still paying off $11,000 in medical debt from Marcus's accident, debt the military survivor benefits hadn't fully covered. She knew, and she used it as a small, precise blade, the way she'd been using small, precise blades against me since we were children, and she discovered that the fastest way to make me smaller was to remind me what I didn't have. Damon laughed behind her. That was the first time I heard it, a low, satisfied sound, like he'd just watched his wife win a fight he hadn't needed to enter. I went home. I didn't say anything to Maya about it. But I started keeping a small notebook in my nightstand drawer that night, dates, times, exact words, a habit I hadn't needed since I stopped keeping incident logs for command. I told myself I was just being careful. I didn't fully admit, not yet, that some part of me already understood this wasn't going to stay small. By the second week of April, it wasn't small anymore. Damon had taken to parking his truck at an angle that blocked half our shared street, forcing school buses to idle and honk most mornings. When Mrs. Delgado from number 4402 asked him politely to move it, he told her, loud enough for half the block to hear, that she should mind her own driveway before someone minds it for her. Nobody called the police. That surprised me at first, until I understood why. Damon had a way of remembering who complained, and a way of making sure their trash cans ended up knocked over, their car alarms triggered at 3 a.m., their garden hoses slashed. Nothing provable. Nothing that would hold up if you called it in. Just enough to teach a neighborhood that silence was cheaper than justice. I wasn't silent. That was the problem, according to Damon. On April 14th, I asked him, calmly, the way I'd once talked down agitated recruits twice my rank, to keep the noise down before 7 a.m. because Maya had a state exam that morning. He crossed the street. He climbed my porch steps. And he told me, with his hand against my collarbone and my daughter 6 feet behind me, exactly what would happen to me the next time I talked back. I didn't call the police that day either. Not because I was afraid. Because I already understood, standing there absorbing that shove without moving my feet, that whatever justice found its way to Damon Vance was not going to come from a patrol car pulling up to Larchmere Drive with its lights spinning. It was going to come from 4 years of training that Iron Line Fight Club's biggest, loudest champion had no idea I was carrying, and from a single phone call I hadn't made yet, to a man who still answered when I dialed his private line, a man who owed me exactly one favor of unlimited size. Damon thought he'd cornered a nervous single mother in a rental house on a quiet street. He had no idea he'd just put his hand on the one person in Oak Ridge Estates who'd been trained to take a man his size apart in under 90 seconds, and that the block party scheduled for that Saturday was going to be the last public appearance he made as a free man. He also had no idea about the notebook in my nightstand drawer, or the 3 photographs I'd already taken of his truck's expired commercial registration, or the name Victoria had mentioned once, drunk and bragging, of the men who actually financed Iron Line's fights, a name that federal investigators had been quietly circling for 11 months before Damon Vance ever moved onto my street. I closed my front door that afternoon, locked it, and sat down across from Maya at the kitchen table to help her study for a test on state capitals. My hands were steady the entire time. They hadn't been steady like that in 6 years. Thursday, April 16th, 2 days after Damon put his hand on me, I drove to the Ridgeline County Clerk's office on my lunch break instead of eating. I told myself I was just being thorough. That's the story I gave myself, anyway. In reality, something old and familiar had switched on inside me, the same instinct that used to make me double-check a perimeter 3 times before I trusted it was clear. I needed information. Information was the only weapon I'd ever fully trusted. I requested the property records for 4417 Larchmere Drive. The clerk, a woman named Patricia Ostrowski who'd processed my own rental paperwork for years earlier, pulled the file without much interest until she saw the purchase price. "Ha," she said. "That's a cash sale. $612,000, no mortgage on record." I asked her to repeat that. Damon ran an underground fight club out of a warehouse. Victoria hadn't worked in 9 years, not since she quit her position at a marketing firm in Cincinnati to focus on her wellness brand, which as far as I could tell consisted of an Instagram account with 340 followers. 2 people with no visible income had paid over $500,000 in cash for a house directly across the street from mine. I didn't think that was a coincidence. I've never been someone who believes in coincidence, not after 4 years of watching supply routes get compromised by information that was never supposed to leak. I started digging the way I used to dig through intelligence reports, methodically, without letting myself get ahead of the facts. Here is what I hadn't told you yet about my sister, because the master version of this story requires I be honest about what I hid even from myself. Victoria wasn't just cruel. She was strategic in a way I'd spent years refusing to acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant admitting our entire childhood had been a series of moves I never saw her make until they'd already landed. When our father was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's in 2015, Victoria positioned herself as his primary caregiver almost immediately, moving into his house on Redwood Lane, managing his finances to help him, taking over his power of attorney by the following spring. I was overseas at the time, 3 months into a deployment rotation I couldn't leave. I called every week. I sent money. But I wasn't there, and Victoria made sure that absence became the entire story. What I didn't find out until Gregory Aldous read our father's will in 2021 was that our father's retirement account, a $290,000 401k he'd built over 31 years working for the Ridgeline County Road Department, had been quietly restructured in October 2018, 8 months before he died, with Victoria added as sole beneficiary. Not co-beneficiary. Sole. I contested it. My attorney at the time, a tired, kind man named Robert Chin who took my case for a reduced rate because he'd served in the Navy himself, told me contesting a beneficiary designation on a retirement account is one of the hardest things to win in probate court because courts generally defer to the paperwork, not the relationship. We lost. I paid Robert Chin $4,200 for 4 months of work that changed nothing, and I told myself I was done fighting my sister over money, because the alternative was becoming someone I didn't want Maya to grow up watching. I hadn't thought about that 401k in 3 years. Standing in the clerk's office holding a cash sale record for a $612,000 house, I thought about it again. That Thursday night, I sat at my kitchen table with the property record, my old notebook, and a legal pad, and I built a timeline the way I used to build them for command, dates on the left, facts on the right, gaps marked in red. October 2018, Dad's 401k restructured. June 2019, Dad passes. Will names Victoria sole beneficiary of retirement account, primary heir to house and savings. 2021, I contest, lose, pay $4,200. 2023, Victoria's Instagram wellness brand shows no revenue, no products for sale, no clients tagged. February 2026, Victoria and Damon purchase a $612,000 house in cash. Somewhere between no visible income and $612,000 cash, there was a story nobody had told me, and I intended to find it. I didn't do it out of greed. I want that understood clearly, because I know how this can sound. I did it because a man who threatened to put me in an ambulance in front of my daughter was living across the street funded by money I couldn't explain, and in my experience, unexplained money and unpredictable violence are almost never unrelated. The isolation started the following week, and it was subtler than Damon's fists, which made it more effective. Mrs. Delgado stopped waving when I walked Maya to the bus stop. When I asked her directly on April 21 if something was wrong, she looked uncomfortable and said, "Victoria mentioned you'd been unstable since your husband." Just didn't want trouble. Unstable. That word traveled through Oakridge Estates faster than any fact I could have offered to counter it. Victoria had spent 3 weeks quietly reframing me at book clubs and driveway conversations, the grieving widow who'd never fully recovered, the sister who'd always had a temper, the woman people should be gentle around but also, subtly, a little wary of. It was elegant, honestly. I recognized the tactic because I'd been trained in versions of it myself. You don't attack the target directly, you attack their credibility first, so that when the real conflict happens, nobody believes the target's account of it. By April 25th, 3 neighbors who used to nod at me in passing had started crossing the street instead. Maya noticed. She asked me at dinner why Mrs. Delgado's daughter Anna wasn't allowed to come over for a playdate anymore, and I told her some people were just busy, because I hadn't yet found a way to explain to a 10-year-old that her mother was being quietly erased from her own neighborhood by a woman who'd been doing this since we were children, fighting over a shared bedroom. The confession came from a place I didn't expect. Damon's older training partner, a man named Ruben Castillo, who ran the equipment side of Ironline out of the same Route 22 warehouse, showed up at the Public Works Department on April 27, saying he needed to speak to me about a permit dispute regarding a commercial loading zone. It was a pretext. I understood that within the first 90 seconds of the conversation. Ruben was scared. Not of me, of Damon, and increasingly, of the man who actually financed Ironline's operation, someone Ruben referred to only as the Colonel, never a real name. He told me, sitting in a county conference room drinking bad coffee from a vending machine, that Damon had been bragging for months about family money finally paying off, about a wife who'd handled her old man's account years ago and was now quietly moving pieces of it through Ironline's books to make it look clean. Ruben didn't know the exact numbers. He knew enough to be afraid of what he did know, which was that federal auditors had already subpoenaed Ironline's financial records twice in the past year, and that the Colonel had told Damon directly to stop drawing attention, stop the driveway blocking, stop the noise complaints, stop making enemies on a street full of homeowners who might eventually call someone with real authority. Damon hadn't listened. He thinks he's untouchable, Ruben said, not looking at me. Thinks being big enough scares people out of ever checking. I thanked him. I didn't tell him what I used to do, or who I still knew, or that I had a former commanding officer 3 phone calls away who'd spent the last decade running financial crimes investigations for a joint federal task force, and who owed me a favor large enough to move mountains. I went home that night and added one more line to my timeline: federal subpoenas, Ironline financial records, 2 occasions, year unspecified. I looked at Maya's math test on the refrigerator. She'd gotten a 94, corrected the state capital of Delaware after I quizzed her twice, and I thought about how close Damon had stood to her on my porch, and how certain he'd seemed that nobody in this quiet, embarrassed, complaint-averse neighborhood would ever be capable of stopping him. Saturday was the Oakridge Estates spring block party. Every family on Larchmere Drive would be there, including Damon, including Victoria, including the 3 neighbors who'd started avoiding me. I didn't know yet exactly what would happen when Damon reached for me in front of all of them. I only knew, with the same clean certainty I used to feel checking a weapon before a mission, that he was going to reach for me, because men like Damon always mistake stillness for surrender, right up until the moment they discover it never was. What I didn't expect was the phone call I'd receive at 8:14 that Friday night, from a number I hadn't seen in 6 years, that would tell me exactly how much bigger this was than one bad neighbor across the street. The call came at 8:14 p.m. on Friday, April 30th, from a Virginia area code I hadn't dialed in 6 years. Vance, the voice said, and just like that I was 28 again, standing in a briefing room at Fort Bragg, listening to Colonel Marcus Whitfield read out a training schedule like it was scripture. Whitfield wasn't my husband, different Marcus, a coincidence that used to make people laugh at reunions. He'd been my commanding officer for 3 of my 4 years as a combat instructor, the man who signed my transfer papers when I requested reassignment closer to home, after my husband died, and the man I'd once pulled out of a compromised extraction route in Ramstein by recognizing a pattern nobody else had flagged in time. He told me that night he owed me one, unlimited, no expiration. I hadn't called it in. Not once in 6 years. I need a favor, I said. The kind you offered a long time ago. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything." I told him about Damon. About Victoria. About the cash-purchased house, the restructured 401k, Ruben Castillo's warehouse confession, the words "the Colonel," and federal subpoenas, and financial records. I told him what Damon had said on my porch, with Maya standing behind me. When I finished, Whitfield didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he said something that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. "Elena, I need you to understand something. I've spent the last 14 months on a joint task force out of the Richmond field office investigating an underground fight circuit financing operation that's been laundering money through at least 6 states. We call the organizer the Colonel internally too, not because he's military, because he runs his operation like one. If your brother-in-law's club is connected to this, you're not dealing with a bar fight. You're dealing with a federal target we've been trying to build a case against for over a year, and every piece of information you just gave me might be the missing link." I sat at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear and felt something shift into place, the way it used to when a mission briefing suddenly made sense of 6 disconnected reports. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Don't do anything that draws law enforcement attention before Saturday," he said. "No confrontations, no calls to local PD, nothing that spooks him into moving money or destroying records. I have a team that can move fast once we have enough to act on, but I need 48 hours, and I need you to stay exactly as invisible as you've been." I told him I would. I was lying, and I think some part of him already knew it, because the man threatening my daughter's safety wasn't going to wait 48 hours to make his next move, and neither, if I'm honest, was I. Saturday, May 1st. The Oak Ridge Estates spring block party started at 2 p.m. on Larchmere Drive, folding tables set up along both curbs, a rented popcorn machine humming outside the Hendricksons' garage, 40 or 50 neighbors moving between coolers and lawn chairs under a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. I brought a tray of lemon bars I didn't want to make and wore a plain gray t-shirt I chose deliberately, nothing that restricted movement, nothing that looked like I'd prepared for anything. Maya stayed close to me most of the afternoon, which told me she felt it too, some pressure building under the surface of an ordinary Saturday. Victoria arrived at 2:40 in a white sundress, performing warmth for an audience the way she always had, laughing loudly at things that weren't funny, touching people's arms, making sure everyone remembered how present she was. Damon trailed behind her in a black tank top that showed off arms built from 3 years of underground fighting, a beer already in his hand. He found me near the dessert table at 3:15. "Didn't think you'd show your face," he said, loud enough for the Pattersons and Mrs. Delgado to hear. "Guess even unstable people like free food." There it was, Victoria's word, delivered through Damon like a rehearsed line. I didn't answer. I picked up a lemon bar, put it on a paper plate, and started to walk away, and that stillness, the same stillness that had confused him on my porch, apparently offended him more than any response could have. He grabbed my arm. Not a shove this time. A full grip, his hand closing around my forearm hard enough that I felt it in my shoulder, and he pulled, meaning to spin me around in front of everyone, meaning to finish in public what he'd started on my porch. I want to describe exactly what happened next the way it actually happened, without exaggeration, because the truth is more precise than any embellishment could be. I rotated into the pole instead of away from it, using his own grip and momentum against his wrist joint the way I'd taught 200 recruits to do over 4 years, a movement that takes less than a second once your body remembers it, no matter how many years have passed. His wrist folded at an angle it wasn't built to fold at. He dropped to one knee on the Hendricksons' front lawn, and the sound that came out of him wasn't a shout. It was smaller than that. Surprised. His training partner, a wide man I recognized from Ruben's description as one of the Iron Line crew, started forward, and I put my free hand flat against his chest, not a strike, just enough pressure at a specific point below his sternum to make him understand, immediately, that continuing forward was not a good decision he wanted to make in front of 40 witnesses. He stopped. I leaned down toward Damon, still on one knee, his wrist locked, his face somewhere between confusion and the beginning of real fear. "You have about 4 inches of extra weight and 40 pounds of extra muscle on me," I said, quiet enough that only he could hear it. None of that matters if you don't know where your own center of balance is. I could have broken this wrist in the first half second. I didn't because my daughter is standing 40 feet away, and I don't want the last image she has of a Saturday to be someone's bone snapping in a stranger's yard. I released him. The entire exchange, from the moment he grabbed my arm to the moment I let go, took 19 seconds. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. The block party went silent in the specific, suspended way a room goes silent when something has happened that nobody present has the vocabulary to process yet. Damon stood up slowly, cradling his wrist, and for the first time since he'd moved onto Larchmere Drive, I watched something other than arrogance move across his face. Victoria crossed the lawn fast, her sundress catching wind, and grabbed Damon's arm, glaring at me with an expression I recognized from 30 years of being her younger sister, not concern for her husband, calculation for herself. "You just assaulted him," she said. "In front of everyone. I hope you understand what you just did to your life." I looked at the 40 or 50 neighbors standing around us, phones already half raised, Mrs. Delgado's daughter on a filming without her mother noticing, and I understood exactly what I'd done. I'd given a federal task force something they'd been missing for 14 months. I'd given myself something I hadn't had in 6 years, proof, in front of witnesses, of exactly what kind of man Damon Vance really was underneath the noise and the muscle and the threats. And I'd given Victoria something she'd apparently already decided to use, because by Monday morning, 2 Ridgeline County Sheriff's deputies were standing on my porch with a warrant application my sister had personally sworn out, one that claimed I'd attacked her husband without provocation, and that I posed enough of a danger to consider an emergency custody review for my own daughter. I stood in my doorway reading the paper the deputy handed me, and felt something I hadn't felt in 6 years of careful, quiet, controlled living. Not fear. Certainty that Victoria had just made the single worst calculation of her entire life, because she'd finally, publicly, put my daughter's custody on the table, and there is exactly one thing on this earth I was ever trained to protect at any cost, long before I was ever trained to fight. The custody review hearing was scheduled for May 19th, 18 days after Victoria swore out her warrant application, and in those 18 days I did something I hadn't done in 6 years of building a small, careful, unremarkable life. I stopped hiding what I used to be. I called Robert Chin first, the attorney who'd lost my inheritance case in 2021, and told him what I needed this time wasn't probate, it was a family law defense, and I needed it built on documentation, not sympathy. He agreed before I finished the sentence. "I've been waiting for years for you to come back with something I could actually win," he said. I called Colonel Whitfield second. "You didn't wait 48 hours, he said, and I could hear something between exasperation and respect in his voice. "I waited 19 seconds, I said. Then I stopped." He told me the footage from the block party, 3 different neighbors' phone videos, including Ana Delgado's, which had already been uploaded to a neighborhood social app and viewed several thousand times by the following Tuesday, had done something for his task force that 14 months of subpoenas hadn't managed. It showed Damon Vance in public, threatening and grabbing a woman in front of dozens of witnesses, consistent with a pattern of intimidation his task force had already documented from 3 other Iron Line associates who'd been too afraid to testify. My case, ugly as it was, gave federal investigators corroborating evidence they could use to approach those witnesses again. "We're moving Thursday," he told me on May 6, "financial records, property seizures, the works. I can't promise you it'll help your custody hearing directly. But it's going to be very hard for your sister to explain a $600,000 cash house once federal auditors start asking where the money actually came from." On May 8, federal agents executed search warrants at the Iron Line warehouse on Route 22 and at 4417 Larchmere Drive simultaneously, at 6:15 in the morning. I watched from my kitchen window with Maya still asleep upstairs, agents in windbreakers carrying bankers' boxes out of the house across the street, while Victoria stood on her own porch in a robe, arguing with a woman in a suit who never stopped writing on a clipboard. What came out over the following 2 weeks, through court filings Robert Chin obtained and shared with me piece by piece, was more than I'd expected. Victoria hadn't just quietly inherited our father's restructured 401k in 2019. Between 2020 and 2024, She'd moved roughly $340,000 of that money through a series of transfers into accounts connected to Damon's Fight Club, first as loans, then, once Damon's operation grew, as investment capital that funded travel, fighter payouts, and eventually the cash purchase of the house across from mine. The Federal Task Force's forensic accountants traced 11 separate transfers, the largest a single $95,000 wire in September 2023 that Victoria had never declared as income anywhere. She hadn't built a wellness brand. She'd built a laundering pipeline for her husband's illegal operation, funded almost entirely by money that should have gone toward supporting our aging father before he died, or by any reasonable accounting, split between the two of us as his daughters. Damon was charged on May 12 with 2 counts of felony assault stemming from prior, previously unreported incidents involving other Iron Line fighters, plus conspiracy charges tied to the financial network. Victoria was charged on May 14 with structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements and conspiracy to launder proceeds of illegal gambling operations. Neither charge had anything to do with me directly, but both made the emergency custody claim Victoria had filed against me look exactly like what it was, a desperate, retaliatory move by a woman facing federal prosecution, trying to discredit the one witness who'd already proven, in front of dozens of people, that she wasn't afraid of her husband's size or her sister's cruelty. The custody hearing on May 19 lasted 40 minutes. Victoria's attorney withdrew the emergency petition before the judge, a measured woman named Deborah Ruiz, had finished reading the first page of Robert Chen's response brief, which included the block party footage, Ruben Castillo's sworn statement about Damon's pattern of threats, and a summary of the federal charges filed against both Victoria and Damon 5 days earlier. Judge Ruiz looked at Victoria across the courtroom and said, in a voice that carried more weight for its calm than any raised voice could have, "I would encourage you to reconsider ever filing something like this again unless you're prepared for it to be examined this closely." Victoria didn't look at me on her way out. I noticed that. 6 years of estrangement, 1 funeral, 1 lost inheritance case, 1 attempted custody theft, and in the end she left the courtroom without a single glance in my direction, which told me more clearly than any confrontation could have that whatever relationship we might have salvaged had ended somewhere long before that Saturday on Larchmere Drive, probably back in 2018, when she signed papers restructuring our father's 401k, and decided I'd never need to know. Damon pleaded guilty in August to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation against the Colonel's wider network. The actual Colonel, the financier Ruben had been too frightened to name, a man named Harlan Voss who ran 6 states' worth of underground fight circuit laundering and who Colonel Whitfield's task force had been building a case against for over a year before I ever picked up the phone. Damon received 18 months, most of it in a minimum security facility 3 hours from Ridgeline County. Victoria pleaded to a single count of structuring, received probation, and a $180,000 restitution order, and put the Larchmere Drive house up for sale by September. I didn't celebrate any of it, not the way I might have expected to years earlier. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after watching your own family collapse in slow motion, even when the collapse is one they built entirely themselves. What I did instead, the week after Damon's sentencing, was sit down with Maya at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd built a timeline out of dates and dollar amounts back in April, and tell her the truth about who her mother used to be. I told her about the 4 years I spent as a combat instructor, about her father and the accident, and the year I spent deciding whether staying in uniform was worth missing her first steps. I told her that the woman who'd dropped Damon to one knee on the Hendricksons' lawn wasn't someone new, wasn't a secret I was ashamed of. She was someone I'd set aside for a while, because I thought Maya needed a quiet, unremarkable mother more than she needed an honest one. Maya was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she asked, "Were you scared when he grabbed you?" "No," I told her. "I was scared before that. I was scared every single day he stood across the street from us, wondering if I'd have to choose between staying invisible and keeping you safe. The moment he actually grabbed me was the easiest part of the whole thing." She thought about that, the way she thinks about everything, carefully and a little too seriously for a 10-year-old. Then she said, "I'm glad you weren't invisible anymore. Larchmere Drive is quieter now." The house at 4417 sold in October to a retired schoolteacher, and her husband, who keep a small vegetable garden along the side fence, and wave every morning without fail. Mrs. Delgado apologized to me in November, awkwardly, over coffee, admitting she'd believed Victoria's version of events longer than she should have. Anna and Maya are back to trading books and having sleepovers most Fridays. I still work at the Public Works Department. I haven't gone back to any kind of formal training work, though Colonel Whitfield has asked twice now whether I'd consider consulting on a task force he's building around exactly this kind of financial and physical intimidation network, men who use fear as infrastructure, families who let money justify almost anything. I told him I'd think about it. What I know for certain is this: I spent 6 years believing that protecting Maya meant becoming smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. I learned, standing on a stranger's lawn with my brother-in-law's wrist locked in my hand, and my daughter watching from 40 feet away, that the opposite was true the entire time. She didn't need a mother who disappeared. She needed one who knew exactly how much weight she could carry, and exactly when to stop being quiet about it.